Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Katie Palmer. She's the co-director of the theater and Asylum production, The Nobodies Who Were Everybody. She's a graduate of NYU's NYU Tisch School of the Arts with a BFA in drama. She's the founding co-artistic director of Theater and Asylum. And Theater and Asylum joyfully pursues a rigorously researched and ensemble-driven approach to theater making. They create performances to investigate our past, interpret our present, and imagine our future. They prize space to process, space to question. Asylum. Katie has co-created all 13 of their original 13 productions, which has been presented across New York City and the East Coast and internationally in London and mainland Europe. Katie, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you both so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, and just to give our guests a little bit of a background. So our friend Michael Rice, who I want to give a shout out to, he and I were at a play a couple of weeks ago, which Alan just mentioned. And so both he and I really liked the play, and we figured, well, we were talking, and we figured, why not get somebody from the play or on the play, get them on the podcast, because we often don't focus on the arts. And it seemed like just based on the themes of the play, and obviously, some of the acting too, it seems like arts, for the most part, is not only just underfunded, but there's a kind of misconception of its sort of utility in society. So, I want to kind of get into the philosophy of all of it, but I also do want to get your background. So, all right, I'm going to actually put my first question aside. So, Katie, first tell us a little bit about who you are, how you became interested in the arts, and then I actually want to get into the philosophy of it and what arts do mean to society and the culture at large.
Yes, absolutely. So I am the co-artistic director of Theater and Asylum. My co-artistic director is Paul Bedard. He and I met in college at NYU, and then right when we graduated, we kind of looked around and said, what next? And so we made this theater company, and we've been going for 13 years with 13 productions. And wow. So Paul and I are the two-headed monster of the piece of the project. And then we have a third person, Catherine Appleton, who's our managing director. And she handles a lot of the logistics, business, finance stuff. And Paul and I are the artistic leaders of the company. So we are a devised theater company. So that means that we don't exclusively work with playwrights, where a playwright writes a play in a room all by themselves and then brings it to us. We're working in a collaborative, co-conspirator way. So The Nobodies Who Were Everybody was a 18 to 24 month process, which I can get into all the specifics of how we did that. But we were co-creating with the incredible group of actors throughout the entire time we were working on that show. Paul and I continually editing until we came up with the show that you saw a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I love that. And so, now going into the play, because for me, at least, that's what I mainly want to talk about, obviously, even though we're going to get into other things. So I remember, so the play was obviously set in the Great Depression. And the theme from what I remember was essentially, how important are the arts when, let's say, a group of people, a collective society, when people are struggling, people aren't able to make ends meet, etc. And then you obviously in the middle of all of this have a bunch of actors who aren't able to make ends meet because people aren't necessarily paying for plays at that point. And so essentially the government was the one, they were relying on the government to fund them because, obviously, most people, first of all, are not going to be able to do it. And then on top of that, the idea is that people need some form of entertainment. But would you say at that point when you guys were sort of conceiving of the play that it was sort of thought of that arts were more than just entertainment? Because, on the one hand, you could say, well, we have, a certain amount of money to ration out, obviously food, let's say welfare checks, benefits, whatever, that's probably going to take prominence. But if we're thinking about, the arts, like on the whole, the question is, what do they mean for our society at large, especially for one that's struggling? Because it could easily be debased by saying, well, it's just entertainment. Can't you just do something else?
Yes. Oh my goodness. I have so many thoughts. Thank you for watching the show and listening so carefully. It's amazing to hear what we have been so excited and grappling with for almost 2 years, reflected back in that way. So thank you so much. The place I'll actually start answering your question, and then you can focus me more, is so the play itself is specifically about the Federal Theater Project. And the Federal Theater Project was alive for 4 years, from 1935 to 1939. And as you alluded to, it was a part of the Great Depression. So there was the New Deal, and inside that, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And inside of that, all of the WPA was entirely about putting people back to work, right? So the federal government looked all across the country and saw who's out of work, who needs work. And I'm not sure who had the really good, smart vision to say artists are also out of work. We've been in this Great Depression for up to 6 years at that point. We need to, one of the ideas was to actually conserve their skills so people didn't leave the field, and to make art for the betterment of the world, and for the country, and to continue that. So the Federal Theater Project was created as an extension of the Works Progress Administration. And we initially got fascinated and interested in the story because of the woman who was the director. Her name is Hallie Flanagan, and she directed the project all 4 years it existed. And she is just incredible and visionary, and like a very unlikely hero, and an unlikely leader, but was just the right person at the right time. And so to loop all the way back to your question, something I have taken so much inspiration from is that she, better than almost anyone I can imagine, has been able to link theater to democracy, and to say that theater is vital for a healthy democracy. The Greek, theater as we know it in the United States, you could argue started in the Greek theater 2,500 years ago. And historically, theater and democracy were invented at basically the exact same time. And so since then, they have been this like intertwined discipline. And so Hallie Flanagan was able to say that a thriving democracy must have a thriving theater, and these two are interconnected.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Like theater is essentially, I mean, rather plays can be sometimes commentaries on what's currently going on in society, right? And kind of inspire people to maybe think differently about whatever the current situation is, right? Without that creativity, I mean, it's just kind of, they're kind of running on automatic, kind of, I don't know, I guess kind of just getting influence just from government or society in some other way. They're not really being stimulated to think other ways, right? One thing that's actually very interesting to me that I caught is that you said that, if I'm not mistaken, you said it's an 18-month project, the Nobodies Who Were Everybody. So
Yes.
what was like COVID sort of like an inspiration to sort of work on this? Because right, like nobody could perform during that time. There's this lockdown essentially. Broadway was closed too, right? If I'm not mistaken, all these actors were out of work. Is that sort of like something that kind of inspired this project?
Absolutely, yes. And more, even more detailed than that, the parallels of what actors were called on to do, and what theater was called on to do. So out of COVID, right, everything shut down, and it was so hard because it was this double whammy of people couldn't go out, like we couldn't be outside, or sorry, let me start over. We couldn't be together in physical space. And that is what theater is, people gathering in a physical space together. So our art form was just eviscerated in an instant. Theater people are incredibly creative and incredibly talented and incredibly scrappy. And we made work in alleys and in parks and on Zoom. Like we did whatever we could to continue to process and share and communicate through the pandemic. But one of the biggest talking points from especially our city and our state government was all about how important the arts are. New York City is an art city and an art state, right? Like there was so much talk from politicians all about how the arts are so important to the city and to humanity and all of that. And then eventually in 2021, there was money that was given to the arts. There was a huge stimulus package that was given from the federal government to the state, and NISCA increased its budget for arts just astronomically overnight. And there was so much more funding. And then the city actually came up with the City Artist Corps, where they did $5,000 lottery grants to artists.
Wow.
And you didn't even, right, like it was not even it was a very, very simple application, and it was a lottery system. So it really was attempting to address need in a very equitable way. And that all happened in 2021. And then all of a sudden, we're through the pandemic, Broadway is open, and here we are, and the funding has evaporated again. So the fact that we were so important and so vital for a year as this recovery was happening, quote unquote, and now that we're quote unquote past the pandemic, the arts are really struggling, they're really flailing, and they do not have the support. Like, arts need so much government investment, and we weren't doing great. Theater wasn't doing super great before the pandemic. We got this huge influx of attention and money, and that just created a baseline, and now that has been taken away. So all that's to say, there were a lot of parallels between the politicians talking about the vitalness of arts and the vitalness of artists, and a giant influx of money for theater and the arts. And then, just like the Federal Theater Project, in 4 years, it got taken away. For us, it was even less.
Wow. Yeah. And then wow. So what's so interesting, I guess, or I guess even terrible is, so I want to kind of give you a bit of a challenging question. So it's not just FYI, it's not meant to be kind of combative. I'm just wondering, because on the other side, somebody might say, well, we live in a capitalistic society, right? So if, you guys want funding, make better plays, right? So, I mean, obviously, I'm assuming your understanding of the arts is way more nuanced than, the way kind of commerce there works. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, why wouldn't that be a good argument to make?
Absolutely. And like, I even heard it in the way I was trying to describe it. So I think it's a great question to come back at me with. I feel like our government, that this is how governments function, they provide public goods, right? Like, there are things that we agree as a society that are valuable for human beings to live together, and we should pay for those things. I am not saying that's an easy conversation that we ever have at any level of government, right? I mean, everywhere between defund the police to funding the military to schools getting cut, like, this is not, I'm not saying this is an easy thing, but as a society, we continually over and over again determine what is appropriate for the government money to be spent on. Right. And the arts are like, should be considered something that vital, and it is continually cast aside. So, right, there's a lot of things that don't exist in our capitalist society. I think education being one of the primary examples. Right, in order to have an educated population, we have to have free public school. There's just no way around it. We have to have a military in order to have, right, it can't be privatized. That's crazy. Obviously, we could, there's a lot more argument there, but right, like, these things we've agreed upon are for the public good. And again, we can have a very nuanced conversation about every single one of those, but the arts are continually misunderstood and left out. And while there is the commercial art, they're like, I love commercial art, it's great, but it's a very different model. And to your point a little while ago about entertainment, right? There's a lot of like kind of going to a lower common denominator as opposed to art that really tries to push and challenge people. And so there's a lot of commercial art that pushes and challenges people, but there's a lot of it that blows things up on screens. Yeah, so I think that's part of the argument of why, like, there's a lot that our society and capitalism does not support. And that is why we have a government, in order to fund that stuff. And the arts should be much more a part of that conversation.
I'm with you. It definitely makes sense, because, I mean, you also want people to see your plays, as many people as possible. So you do want to make it affordable, right? If you commercialize it, right, in order for, I guess, the theater to make enough money between, paying the different staff, theater crew, everybody in the production. And so it's interesting, because like, that's why it makes sense. Like, if they were funded, right, if they could then make, like, maybe viewing the play more affordable to the public. Yes. Otherwise, you'd have to take like a sort of model, like maybe I don't know, charging $50 a head or whatever it is.
No.
And then at the same time doing things like posting ads on Google or whatever, doing different podcasts promoting the show, and then kind of taking like this other sort of stance to it just to get as many people as possible, you know, to go to the show to fund it. But yeah, I mean, the whole point of art, right, is that I mean, it is for the people, right? So if you charge $50 a head, I mean, I don't know, like who are you really getting to that show? It's definitely not everybody. It's not like
And can I add to that?
please.
Okay. And then, so yeah, if you're even thinking about like, let's say influencers, right? That's an interesting topic. So when you have somebody who is an influencer, how did they get popular? I mean, oftentimes they're already well funded, right? So people who, let's say, become popular on social media or whatever. And then, so why?
Not necessarily.
I know, but a lot of times, yeah. So, okay, we can kind of go back and forth about it. But so, okay, my point is to say that a lot of people already start out with wealth, and a lot of times it's not known. And there's also something called the Matthew effect, where the more you have, the more you get. Where you have, let's say, a lot of popularity, and then you become even more popular. So what's so hard is getting people kind of started, and I think that's kind of the point that we're making with Katie. So yeah, I understand. I know there are
I'm sorry, no, I was only thinking of like TikTok and stuff like that. Like somebody get popular on TikTok, get a whole bunch of views, I suppose,
but
get advertising.
who also has time to do that? People who have a lot of money, man, who can shoot their shot with TikTok.
I mean, if you're a kid, you're not expected to work at a certain
but,
point. Maybe
but it's not kids. But it's not kids. Kids usually
exist.
Oh my. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He's trying to make like this like really good point, and I'm just giving this like weird example.
And now I have to say this. You should look into like the what are they called? So like these moms that have like that pretty much oh my god, what are they called? So they're like momfluencers where they have these kids that they put on like YouTube and TikTok, and a lot of times you don't see behind the scenes like how they become popular, what they do, and they're like they're horrible people, man, and they like literally abuse these kids behind the scenes, and they make a ton of money off of them. Whatever, but
back to your point.
Yeah, okay. So that is the thing, right? So going back to so art, right? So the point is that I'm making is that it's very hard to gain popularity in the first place, and oftentimes popularity begets popularity. So what you have is like this well-connected network of people and of artists who kind of they rub each other's backs, you know, and essentially they become popular because they've already been popular and because they already know, let's say, the popular crowd or whatnot. So I think what you guys are trying to do is you're trying to say, well, what we're doing is we're evening the playing field. We're making it so that the sort of talent, you know, the cream of the crop can kind of rise up, right? And so the idea is, it's like we don't want it to be what's that quote? It's like a rising tide lifts all ships. We don't necessarily want that, because a lot of times, again, people aren't in those exact networks. So would you say that when you're talking about government funding, what we're saying is there are a lot of talented people out there, and look, whether or not you'd like them, you know, that's your call at the end of the day, but they at the very least deserve their time to shine and just to see what they can make of their lives.
Yeah, I think, a lot of that for sure. And we had this line in the play, or this moment in the play, where two of our characters were talking just about the reality that like there's just not enough jobs in so many fields.
Yeah, the Ida character.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that we just lose out on that art. And we just lose out on all of these people's training and experience and thought and expertise. We just lose it as a society, and like people who devote years, if not decades, of their lives to this thing, to communicate and to share and to challenge and to move people, and we just lose it. And that just feels so sad and feels so unnecessary. So that's definitely one part of it. Just the other thing, one of my thoughts about funding related to what you were saying, was that we actually have a like living wage budget, a living wage version of the budget of the show. And if we were to have paid everyone a living wage for the whole thing, the tickets would have been $96, which is just so inaccessible and so ridiculous, because your exact point is that theater should be, or what you were saying, Alan, was that theater wants to be accessible. That's what very much the theater we want to make. That's the kind of way we want to change the world, is through accessible art, not tickets that cost $400 on Broadway. But how can we do that, and how can we actually be reaching people at a price point and the place that they're at. And for Theater and Asylum, it's actually incredibly important to keep tickets at a very low cost. So we always have a $0 ticket initiative where people always come to any performance for $0. And then we have a tiered program beyond that, because we really want to try to live and breathe this accessibility and this financial accessibility. And then if I could actually link it back to the Federal Theater Project for a moment from the 1930s, one of the amazing things about how comprehensive that program was and why it's different than what we have in terms of art funding right now is it really looked holistically, and it paid artists to make productions, but it also subsidized tickets. So in 1935 dollars, a Broadway show cost 50 cents, which today is $5.50.
Wow.
That's what you could see a Broadway show for, because of the government subsidizing it. And it worked. 1/4 of all Americans in 4 years saw a Federal Theater Project show. I think of that statistic all the time. I mean, we're only 3 people, but if there were 4 in this room, one of us would have seen the show that was produced. Can you imagine? Like, it's just so many people went, so many people cared. So like, right. And it just teaches us the lesson again of like, it's so related to access. It's not even necessarily related to interest or time or capacity. There's a lot, there's just such limited access to these things. And that is what turns theater into something very elite. People think it's not for them. Theater is people in a room telling stories to each other, and asking each other to communicate and share deeply and think through a problem collectively. There shouldn't be barriers to that.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of theater just in general is, especially when it's let's say, what's the word, not nuance, when it's a little bit more egalitarian, is it's you see yourself in it. And I think for the most part what people want to know is that they matter to their culture, their society. And I want to now take it back to the play. So I think what made the play so special is that you had so many different types of people. So like the Ida character, like she came from one background. I forgot who Addie played. I forgot the name of his character. So he came from another background. You had like this Hispanic dude who was like really funny. He was like the comedic relief of the show. And then he ended up like doing a show in Tampa, which I really appreciated because I was like, oh, I'm a huge Bucks fan. That was cool. That was like a part of the play. And yeah, and so you essentially, you see yourself, like whoever you are, you can find yourself in one of these plays. And I think what probably tends to happen is when you're talking just about elitism, is that elites don't produce plays for everybody. I mean, they produce plays about themselves, which is like, look, I'm not an expert on this, so I can't say exactly for sure, but it seems like the further back into the past you go, the more so the plays are about the upper classes. I mean, I don't exactly remember any ancient Greek plays about poor people. You know, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that elites tend to produce plays for and about themselves. And so again, if it makes you feel like, let's say, I don't know, you're kind of cut out of society, or you're maybe not necessarily ostracized, but let's say you're invisible. You know, you're sort of there's a sort of pretense that you don't exist. I can see how that can make people feel like they're not a part of it. So I would say just art for the sake of just community, or for the sake of knowing that, oh, okay, this isn't this thing that's inaccessible to me, whether it does or doesn't mean something to me in particular, I think that itself is a huge victory.
Yeah, that was so beautifully put. And right, people want to feel connected, and they want to feel seen, and they want to feel like they matter to each other and to their community. One of my favorite moments that I'm the most proud of is the character you're referring to was played, or one of the characters you're referring to was played by an amazing actor, Ari Rivera, and he played a character named Marco, and that character is a Puerto Rican actor. Starts as a vaudeville star, and then he does a bunch of shows in the Federal Theater Project, and he's auditioning for a play in Tampa. And I do not speak Spanish and have a terrible Spanish accent, so I can't even recreate it. But the translation of the title is really terrible. And so he has a line where he says the translation of the title, and then he says, "Don't know who translated that. The title should be X, Y, and Z." And the number of people, specifically Spanish speakers, who told us afterwards, I had the same thought he was having in real time. that's a terrible title. And then he corrected it and came up with a better alternative. And it was just like a small moment of recognition and of connection with that character that I thought was so cool. And I will say huge credit to our amazing collaborators and actors who were willing to bring so much of themselves to the process, to these characters, and allowed Paul and I to continue to shape the whole piece. Actors had continual input throughout the entire process as we continued to edit and shape, but so many kernels and so many pieces of the heart of the show came from their individual experiences and their individual what they wanted to express. And so there's a little bit of form following function and form and content together in our show of like, we wanted to share a community of humans, and we made a community of humans in order to do that.
Is there any sometimes improv involved in the production?
No, not improv. More, we would talk a lot. People would go home and write, and then we would bring it back into rehearsal and we would rehearse it. And then we would talk through how that went. What would we want to edit? What still isn't clear? What wasn't working? And then we'd go away and work on it again and bring it back. The final scene of our play, we spent a whole week in rehearsal. At the last half hour, we would read a new version, we'd talk about it, discuss what didn't work, and then we'd go, Paul would go home and write a new version based on the notes and bring it back in on Tuesday, and we would try it again. We'd gotten some parts, but not other parts, and new parts that were still question marks got revealed. So we went home and rewrote it and brought it back on Wednesday. So it was a very iterative process, a very collaborative process, but not in a improvisational way.
Wow. And then, so yeah, now going back to the democracy idea. So, outside of the fact that, again, people see themselves in these plays, which is wonderful. And I mean, you can see how that could contribute to I would say, a democratic society. Again, people wanting to vote, people feeling like they're able to participate because they're cared for. So how else can plays kind of indicate, what a democracy is supposed to look like? Or better yet, how else is it that plays are important or vital to a democracy? I think that would be a better question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have my Hallie Flanagan quote pulled up. I'll read in a second, but I'll put in my own words first. So how is theater vital to a democracy? Just getting my brain back into it after my preamble. Theater is a participatory medium in which the audience is coming into it and has to engage. It's social. It's a social art form. It's a narrative art form, and it's an art form that grapples and actively wrestles with questions. And we want some people want, in democracy, want an audience want a citizenry that is questioning and active and engaged and listening to each other and listening to different viewpoints, and questioning themselves and questioning each other, and doing it in a societal conversation with each other. And I just think theater mimics that so beautifully. One of the best examples from the Federal Theater Project actually was they did something called living newspapers. And the living newspapers were like real ripped from the headlines topics that they then explained to the audience with a bunch of different viewpoints. So one was called I forget what the one about housing was called, but there was one all about housing. And the show took a bunch of facts, dramatized them, and explained how housing and prices works in New York City. So it was really entertaining. They had tried to represent a bunch of different viewpoints, but it was also very much educating the audience on that topic. So I think theater can be a very that we can combine the education and the entertainment together in a way that almost no other art form really can do. Music, visual art, they're so beautiful, and I would happily talk forever about why I think they're valuable too. But the storytelling element of theater, I think, is so vital to what we can communicate and what questions we can ask, we are asking of the audience. And then if I may, I'll just read a little quote from Hallie Flanagan. It was about a minute long, but the greatest achievement of these public theaters was in their creation of an audience of many millions, a waiting audience. This audience proved that the need for theater is not an emergency. Either the arts are not useful to the development of the great number of American citizens who cannot afford them, in which the government has no reason to concern itself with them, or else the arts are useful in making people better citizens, better workmen, in short, better equipped individuals, which is, after all, the aim of a democracy, in which case the government may well concern itself increasingly with them. The theater in our country should not be regarded as a luxury. It is a necessity, because in order to make democracy work, people must increasingly participate. They can't participate unless they understand, and the theater is one of the great mediums of understanding.
Wow. Yeah, I really love that. And so, you know, what I was thinking when you were saying that, and just even you or your own comment before. So I was thinking with theater, it does something that I think literature not necessarily fails to do, because I don't think it can, nor does it necessarily try. And I would say the news too, but it sort of paints maybe that's not fair. Maybe, no, I'm wrong. That's not fair.
I almost have a feeling where you're going with this. Well, the cool thing about theater is that when you're actually live there, and you're watching the actors perform, the way it differs from, let's say, a movie, right? Like a movie is also like an experience of, you know, you're kind of like sitting there, you're giving 2 hours of your time, whatever. And then this is being portrayed like in your consciousness, and like you could kind of relate to things that's happening in the movie. But the thing that's about it being live is something similar is happening, but it's even more social than that. It's like even more relatable, because you're seeing these people live in the flesh acting out in these sorts of ways. It almost has, it might arguably be the most powerful medium.
You know what I would contrast it to? I can imagine reading a book or reading a headline about, so I want to go back to the play. So reading a book about, let's say, what kind of the experiences were like for people back then, you know, reading about what it was like for somebody, let's say, to be poor, to feel as though, you know, the government doesn't care about the arts or whatnot. But when you see how it dramatized in the play, you actually can't help but empathize with the actors and, you know, the actual people who went through that. And that, I would say, is the difference. So it's one thing to read it somewhere, but it's another thing to actually sort of viscerally feel it right in front of you. So that's why I don't want to like criticize literature, because literature does do that, so that's not fair. But yeah, in terms of play acting and seeing it right in front of you, it's such a different feeling than reading about it 100%. In a book.
No, the impact level is arguably, I really think it's probably the strongest it could possibly. You're seeing people emote right in front of you. It's like, it's not just like, because peripherally you have this understanding when you're watching a movie, oh, this is just a movie. And yes, you could argue, this is just a play, sure. But it's like the degrees of separation between how a movie does that to you and how a play does that to you are different. I feel like you get the closest with the play.
And then, you know, the other idea I would have is in terms of, let's say, our own biases. When you read something, it's easy to kind of explain it away and say, well, like either this is literature or whatever. Like, let's say, you know, the author has an agenda or etc. Right. But I think because we're such emotional creatures, you know, we kind of pick up on things. I think when we feel them, it's easier for us to accept them. So you can kind of discount things again in the media. I mean, I've done it. I've seen things in the media where I'm like, nah, you know, who cares? Like, where's this happening? It's happening somewhere else. You know, it's not really an important part of my life. But then when you're sitting and watching it in front, obviously, like, and the way I love the setup of your play, because you're actually in the middle of it. You're not just the audience. You're pretty much surrounding the actors, which I really love.
Very engaging.
Yeah, it feels engaging. So, and the thing is, you actually feel it. So it's hard for you when that's so in your face. It's hard for you to discount that information. So when you read that passage about us being, let's say, active citizens in a democracy, I think the point is that we actually feel as though these people are connected to us and we have a direct impact on their lives. Whereas again, if you're reading a newspaper, if you're scrolling through to Twitter or whatever, because a lot of us, man, we only have so much sympathy that we want to, I don't even want to say able, that we want to give other people. So it's easy again to just discount it and say, well, this is happening somewhere else, this isn't affecting me, it's not a big deal, etc. You could even watch the play technically and say, well, you know, this happened a long time ago. But what they do, and this is another aspect of what I love, is that they kind of bring it into the forefront in terms of where we are now, and they say, well, actually, this is what we're going through now. And then you're thinking, oh my God, like, so this does kind of in a way affect me, or at the very least in some ways associated with me. So I love that, because again, what these plays do is it seems like it takes the truth and it sort of smacks you in the face with it, and you can't run away.
I love that. Yes, 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 yes. And yeah, again, to just hear your like comments and reflections and the connections you're making is so cool. And I'm just so happy to be here with you. But as you're describing too, right? Theater is just this incredible tool of empathy. And that is like the main thing theater traffics in, is empathy. And how to relate to characters who are like you, how to see yourself in other characters, how to relate to characters who are not like you. And you are doing that to the characters, right? And then as you were describing, Leon, to the way our space is set up, it's a very small, intimate space. And so we performed in the theater term is alley style, where the actors are in the middle and the audiences are on either side. So it's effectively a theater in the round, but that's how it's set up. And so empathetically, you are relating to the characters, you're following their journeys, you're responding, you're thinking through, right? What would I do in that situation? What is this character choosing to do? But you're also noticing the other audience members, and you're hearing their reactions, and you're seeing when they get excited. We've been lucky enough to have several audiences where people are actually talking back to the actors, and so you're like hearing their reactions, and it just adds to the societal element of like, we are here in this together, figuring it out. We can't control anyone else, but we are all here experiencing this and thinking through it together with that degree of empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And then to go back to the political aspect of it. So, you know, and this is just my interpretation. Obviously, I mean, I could be off, but I got the sense I don't know, again, what the kind of intention of the authors were. But essentially I got the sense that when you think about it as so the Red Scare was obviously an issue back then. And you kind of got the sense that, so the politicians and the two characters, so Liat's character, Ida, and I don't remember who the other person, I think Addie's character also played the two Congress people. Yeah. So fundamentally, I mean, there was this scene where so they were pretty much you know, they were kind of buffoons, right? So I mean, that was sort of the point, and you got the sense that it wasn't really about a Red Scare or about communism. It seemed like they were kind of intimidated by this thing that they really didn't understand. So it's like, on the one hand, you know, here's this group of people who are saying, well, you know, we're all about equality, and then this other group that feels kind of threatened by it. So the sense that I got is that I didn't really believe that they actually thought that they were communists. I mean, there was obviously, so the Marco character was obviously, you know, a socialist in the play, but you never really got the sense that it was about communism per se. You got the sense that, again, this thing that they didn't understand seemed like a threat. It seemed like it could have upended them, whether, you know, the political system, the whatever, the kind of oligarchy, if you could call it that. And so it seemed like, if anything, that they really didn't care about who these people were, what they had to contribute, whatever. It was more like, you know, we're afraid, so we need to shut this down, and we need to actively, you know, confirmation bias, we need to actively look for reasons to do so. Would you say that that's kind of spot on or somewhere? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. And to add some just additional like names and facts to that. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, which a lot of us know because of, or like in my schooling, I mostly learned about that because of the McCarthy era and the early 1950s. But that was actually the end of that committee, or that was towards the end of that committee, and that and the Red Scare, that element of it. The House Un-American Activities Committee was actually started in the 1930s, and the first thing they investigated was the Federal Theater Project. And they were, you know, quote unquote, looking for communism. They were, you know, attempting to protect democracy, right? Like that was their stated mission. But it was entirely because they didn't understand, and they didn't want the understanding and the empathy and the communication and the traveling and the spreading of ideas. This is me putting a little bit of my own personal bias onto this, but yes. So Congressman Dyes was the chair of that committee. And they really did go through this kind of banana sham series of hearings about the Federal Theater Project. The Federal Theater Project was censored from the absolute beginning. All the units were, including the Negro theater units. The government was in a constant battle with them of what they were allowed to say. They couldn't say anything anti-democratic, anything pro-communist. And then wrapped up in that was actually a lot of racial integration. The theater in the 1930s, the vast majority of spaces were not racially integrated in this country. And it was a stipulation of the Federal Theater Project that every theater they perform in must be racially integrated. And that's just one small element of the bigger racially integrated platform of communism, of the Federal Theater Project, of what was actually happening with people at that time. And I think the government was really afraid of it in the 1930s, just like they were now. So there was a bit of, they called it communism, but you articulated so beautifully what they were afraid of. And I just wanted to also add, they were also worried about different races, specifically Black and white people working together. Wow. And they were afraid of the unity that could come with that.
Yeah, and even potentially revolution.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was also this great scene, and I wonder how you guys found it. So there's this great scene where against the backdrop, you guys actually played a clip from I think it was the 1930s, the actual program. Yeah, so they actually had like this. It was a kind of on the big screen in the background. It wasn't a screen; it was technically the curtain, but it was on the curtain, and there was this really great scene in the background where I don't remember the exact play. I think it might have been Hamlet.
It was called Voodoo Macbeth. But
Macbeth. Yeah. So can you tell us about that? How did you guys actually get the clip, and why did you decide to use it?
Yeah, so even though there was film at the time, basically nothing is visually documented or movie documented from the Federal Theater Project. We have scripts, we have photos, but we really don't have recordings. There is a single recording, as far as we understand, of a single play. The play was called Voodoo Macbeth. It is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth. They set it on Haiti, and it was up at the Negro Theater Unit in Harlem. It employed 150 actors. It ran for months and months. It toured all around the country. It was this huge success very early for the Federal Theater Project. And so the clip we have is a little bit of what was effectively a commercial that the federal government put together saying, look at this great project we've poured a bunch of money into. Look at the beautiful work and the art and all the people who are employed because of it. So we show in our show, we play the very end, the finale of that show, to try to give people a sense of what it was really like to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super amazing. And then, so what came of the program then? What happened to it?
You mean the Federal Theater Project?
Yep.
It evaporated. It ended. It just shut down. Oh my gosh, this is my favorite story. So if you'll indulge me for 1 minute. Right, our federal government is funded July through June. So on June 30th, what happened, June 30th, 1939, the federal government just canceled funding for the program, and it just stopped funding it. So all of a sudden, 15,000 people were just out of work in a day. All of the productions, all of the costumes, they were building this incredible like theater complex on Treasure Island, which is just outside of San Francisco. I mean, there was so much investment. They were really just getting going. There were already 800 productions in 4 years. Like there was so much momentum. There was so much happening. And the government just like literally wrote a 0 in the budget line. And it stopped on July 1st. That was the end. But my favorite story is there's a congressman who wrote to Hallie Flanagan like mid-July, a few weeks later, and was like, hey, I have this like nephew who's a theater person. Would it be great for them to get involved in the Federal Theater Project? Where could you possibly give them a job? And she wrote back saying, you just defunded my program. You defunded the Federal Theater Project. I can't give anyone a job. There's no jobs anymore. This doesn't exist. And just the disconnect that I politicians in the 1930s have, I think politicians and human beings have now, of like, wait, this big, scary boogeyman idea that I was fighting actually benefited all of these people. And on the individual level was this great, beautiful, complicated, but incredibly valuable thing. And just the disconnect between that of like, I voted to defund a program and I didn't even know I was defunding that because I thought I could get my nephew a job. And the nepotism of obviously the story is ridiculous too. But the just the disconnect between this big, scary, communist, racially integrated government program and what it actually meant to the people on the ground and who was actually benefiting from it. And that disconnect, I think, is something we have certainly not solved in the 80 years since.
I have a related question. This might be silly. I'm not sure if this impacts you, but I'll ask. So the current writer's strike that's going on
That's
right
a great
now,
question. I know what's coming. I love this. Go for it.
Yeah, does that impact you at all, or anyone maybe you work with? And because it's kind of relevant,
Yes,
right?
it 100% is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, it is. It does not impact us directly because actors and stage managers are governed by the Actors Equity Union, which is not currently on strike because it's the writers and the SAG, which are the screen actors. So so we can still produce theater.
Awesome.
We can still make that. That being said, of course, there's a lot of solidarity there. And then one of the questions we're curious about is like, is there a tipping point, and like, where are the kind of the ripples of this sort of conversation that's happening, and or is there enough groundswell across disciplines, across fields, across industries to actually potentially get bigger changes made? And because that was something that was happening in the 30s, right? We have a line we say a little flippantly in the show of like, they're afraid that if they don't give us rabble-rousing actors something to do, we'll all turn red and revolt and want communism. And there was so much of a groundswell of so many unions working together, working against each other, but all fighting for similar things in the 1930s. And if the government didn't do something, they're like, who knows what sort of kind of revolution people might have pushed for in this country. And so that's actually something that I'm curious about with the current strikes. I know someone that I know was picketing in front of Netflix a week or two ago, and they said that they had airline workers, specifically the stewardesses. What are they called? Flight attendants. The flight attendants were also there on the picket line. So like, is there a solidarity across workers, or are we going to stay isolated and segmented and not have it roll into a bigger movement? So that's just a personal wondering about that. And like, but like, artists are often on forefronts of things and ideas, right? We are often the people pushing envelopes and pushing questions and putting ourselves out there. So yeah, and of course I completely stand by the strikers and the workers and them getting the deals that they deserve.
Definitely hope there are some positive ripple effects as far as that goes. I see what you mean. There is potential for that, right? As far as the theater in Asylum, I wanted to ask you, what's next for you guys, actually?
That is such a good question. That's a great question. And it actually leads me to say the one additional thing that I've been thinking about all podcasts that I hadn't gotten to say, which is that I think another reason that theater is so valuable is the collective imagination element of it. The only way our world is going to get better is if we believe and hope and imagine and then put the work into making it. I am not in any way saying hope is enough, but hope is an element for us to keep going and to keep working and keep trying to make a more equitable, more just society. And so I think theater does that kind of more than almost any other medium in two ways: the collectiveness of we're all in this room together thinking through these ideas and imagining together. And then also that, like, that's what plays offer, right? Plays offer questions, they offer ideas that then we go and we grapple with, and we wrestle with, as individuals, as communities, and hopefully as societies. So I really think collective imagination is so important in the world, and theater is uniquely situated to do that. That being said, the next thing that we are interested in doing is something called the End of the World Cabaret. And the idea is the world's pretty, like, right? I mean, I'm sure you could throw a dart at any moment in history, but this is a pretty tough time with the climate change and the election in 2024, and the various threats to our democracy in not a hypothetical way. There's just so much happening. And so it is, the goal is to create a collective brainstorming night that a bunch of different artists are contributing to, that are able to offer hope, empathy, collective imagination of just kind of what to do next. So yeah, that's how we hope to use our art next, is to inspire, to empathize, to have moments of feeling things and the impact, and then to also be inspired to keep going and to be fighting the good fight.
By the way, so we in the beginning we talked about, so just for our audience now, we talked about how we can link this to potentially philosophy. You've literally just described philosophy. I mean, that's it. So it's philosophy in play form. If the ideas, if we're presenting conflicting ideas, let's say conflicting perspectives, and then we try to kind of integrate them together sort of dialectically. I mean, this is it, man. So this is philosophy again, in sort of in live action form, and I love that, because now what you're thinking is, and I would argue, I mean, there's got to be, oh my God, I wish I were better versed in this. I mean, there's got to be some, in terms of ancient Greece, there's got to be some plays where you have like people, I know, like we have now, like there was Freud's Last Session. I don't know if you guys like know about it or saw it. Oh, okay, so yeah, Freud's Last Session, the idea was it was C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud, obviously, and so they kind of went back and forth on ideas, and again, it was a play, right? And so I never saw the play. I read the book, The Question of God. And so what's so interesting about that is you have these two conflicting worldviews, and oftentimes, I mean, they kind of hate each other, right? You have the atheists and the Christians on the other end, but then what they do is, I mean, it's not that they sort of integrated. That's a kind of idealistic thinking in that respect. But what they do is at least they get a further understanding of each other's perspectives. Like you and I have oftentimes about like talked about braver angels and listen different political views and stuff. Okay. So yeah. So what I love about that is that that's actually like active philosophy. That's what you hope what good philosophy would be. And so when you see that like on stage, and a lot of times I think people think that artists have like some sort of, or playwrights have an agenda, but oftentimes it's not exactly that. They're fostering empathy, and they're getting you, they will present the different side. They might not agree with it, but I think the kind of misconception of it is that it's propaganda in some ways. So yeah, so Katie, how would you, so if somebody were to challenge you and say, well, aren't plays just like an arm of propaganda, or a propaganda arm, right? Isn't it just a way for people to kind of instill certain ideas into people? Can't we just learn these things or form our own opinions on our own? What would you say to them?
I would say that that's only a part of what theater does. And I think we should be looking and striving and working towards a theater that is bigger and more holistic than that. And back to the point, I think you were like, before you challenged your own idea, I thought you were making such a beautiful point about clashing ideas together. I think that is what is most interesting about theater and storytelling in general, is each character has its own point of view, and they're representing ideas that they're grappling with in personal ways and political ways, and they get smashed together in this incubator of 90 minutes with no intermission. And we are there with them as they get smashed together. And right, sometimes they break. Sometimes they get integrated. Sometimes they bounce off of each other. And you don't know how, so those are the characters, and you don't know how any of that is affecting each individual person in the audience and what ripples and changes that will make. So I think to think of theater and storytelling as a didactic, you have to believe this, is not engaging with the full range of what theater really can do and really can be.
Right. And now even to challenge my perspective even further, I want to actually go back to the play. So what was great is that you did have these two different perspectives where the Marco character is pretty socialistic and the other ones are kind of like on the fence about it, thinking, we shouldn't really rock the boat. I mean, these are really difficult times. We should be kind of grateful for what we get, etc. And I don't want to exactly say what happened. So Katie, you can correct me. I don't remember the exact details, but I do remember he was supporting a particular, I don't remember the name, the particular political candidate where they were like, no, we can't support him. Like he's an outright communist and then he's also not going to win. So this is not only just a waste of time, but it might make us, it might ruin our reputations. And I think oftentimes, I mean, all of us kind of grapple with this to whatever extent. I would argue that, Katie, I don't know exactly what your politics are. I'm assuming you're a liberal. I don't know to what degree, but I know during the 2016 election, all of us grappled with Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton. So you had the one side that said, okay, well, we agree with Bernie's politics, but then the other side, by the way, I wavered between the two. So then the other side said, yeah, but Bernie's never going to win. So what's the point of doing this? Like, not only are you wasting a vote, but on top of that, you're pretty much you're kind of making her look bad because I mean, Bernie, he wasn't direct attacks, but we attacked Hillary to an extent. So they're like, why are you doing this? You know, because we have to look at the bigger picture. And when you're thinking about going again to the concept of propaganda, why this play is an indicator that playwrights aren't propagandists is that essentially you did have these conflicting views and you had one side of the coin or, you know, one sort of group of people who said something along the lines of like, guys, we have to kind of accept reality and work within it. And then you had the more idealistic side that said, like, you don't understand. You're the ones who are actually wasting your time because if you do vote for this other candidate, we're actually fucked anyway. You're better off joining the revolution. And I think that's kind of where a lot of us were in that Bernie Hillary kind of debate camp, whatever war, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, it's such a great parallel and such a great tie-in to all of this. And my mind's going so fast. I'm trying to like get back to the point I was going to make about that because I think it's really smart. But right, like there's no easy answer. And I think, right, sometimes I think people might get a little frustrated at theater because we're not presenting like, well, here is the simple solution. And because life doesn't work that way. And I think what you just did too is make such a fantastic real world tie to politics, but theater is really related to that of or going all the way back to like theater is necessary for democracy is necessary for a theater because we have to make our own decisions, right? Like each person has to walk into that ballot booth and make their own decision with hopefully with research and with the power of their own conviction and the thought process. And so, right, you can hear all these arguments, right? You go to a play and you hear about why you should vote for one person or why you should vote for another person or what the pros and cons are for revolution or communism or whatever. And then the onus is on the person to make their own decision. And I think theater tries to inspire and challenge and complicate. That's especially the theater and Asylum is trying to do. And then each person has to go back out into the world and live according to how they want to live. And we hope that is an active, intentional choice on their part.
Right. And you could both see this on the political and the personal level, because in the play also there was a dispute with Ida, and I don't remember the other character's name, so that she was essentially moving out, and she didn't know it for a while, and then Marco and that character were getting together, and you could kind of see both sides, you know, and I think, again, we talk about perspective taking, you can see both sides, and you're thinking, oh my God, okay, yes, obviously this person now wants to live with her partner, but then what are you going to do with the friend? But, oh, okay, well, she found another place for the friend, but the friend doesn't necessarily feel comfortable in that place. Yeah, so again, just like with politics, man, I mean, it's kind of hard because I think, again, going back to Hillary and Bernie, a lot, and why I wavered back and forth, because it was hard to make a decision. You're on the one hand thinking, okay, yes, you know, you're probably right, like Hillary isn't going to get much done because, I mean, she's a kind of mainstream mainline Democrat, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, but Bernie can't really win. And I like how in your play that you can see that, again, both societally, politically, and also personally, that a lot of the decisions that we make, man, they are so fucking complicated.
Yeah. And it's hard to be reminded of that sometimes. Sometimes it's easier to just like watch something that's simple, but that's not where theater and democracy really overlap. And that's not where the change and the inspiration will really come from. But yeah, yep. Really, yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome.
And something I'm wondering actually. So what, you know, we might actually end up when this comes out, we might have aspiring theater directors maybe listening, right? What advice would you maybe give to someone who's an aspiring theater director, is very passionate about bringing a story onto the stage and actually creating a production out of it, especially about a story that maybe might have been overlooked?
Yeah, my first idea would be to find your people, to find the people that you want to work with and tell the story with. That's right. Like in theater, it's so about the audience, but it's also we as theater makers are given such this extraordinary gift to work together as we make it. So who we work with is just is a huge part of what feeds us and feeds the work itself. So very much find your people. There are small grants you can apply to through Art New York or the borough grants that can hopefully function as seed money to get started. But yeah, I think what I have been so proud of for theater, we've been around for 13 years. We've gone through a couple different iterations, always with me, Paul, and Catherine at the helm, but we continue as we grow up, as we discover the artists we are and the artists we want to be and the type of company we want to be. We continue to work really hard to come up with our own intentions and our own goals and our own ideals and to work to achieving them. And I think that's part of why we're so proud of the Nobodies Who Were Everybody, because it was a 2-year process where we were constantly growing and expanding and pushing ourselves and opening up to new challenges and to new people. So I think all of that to say, that's why I say find your people, because they are the ones who offer so much in the creation process, and to try to create your art in the most intentional and equitable way.
I love that. And so one of the last things before we go, I have to comment on this. So I told you I went to the play with our friend Mike Rice. So it was so funny. There's a line in the play where the person says something like, "Oh, Eric Adams only cares about seeing his face in the media." And it was so funny because me and Mike were dying during it. So I don't know if you know, Eric is actually a friend of the podcast. He's been on the show before.
I know he's been on it. Yeah.
So we were dying. We both looked at each other. We're like, wow. So that was really funny. You know, in terms of Eric, and I guess, so this is going to be my final question. What would you want to sort of, I'm just going to focus on this is because where we live. What would you want, you know, the kind of establishment or the administration of the New York City, you know, the New York City government, what would you want them to know about kind of like what your campaign is, what you feel is important? What would you want them to change?
Yeah, just that, like, the arts makes the city livable in so many ways, as humans, as for children with arts education, like they just, and all arts, right? All performing arts, the people on the subways, the people in parks, right? Like arts just make the city more livable. And time again, we have all of this research that shows that there's alternative ways we could be interacting with each other, and we could be solving problems. And I would love for the current administration and our city council to have some more collective imagination and to think about different ways to solve our problems than the one force-based way that has kind of perpetuated for several decades. We owe it to ourselves to be more creative and to be more humanistic, more human-minded. And I think the arts are a big part of that, but I think the arts are a part of a much bigger reimagining that we can do. And if you come to the theater, maybe you'll collectively imagine with us of what the alternatives and possibilities are. But yeah, and I will also just say, we had this statistic in our show, but in today's dollars, the Federal Theater Project, employing 15,000 people across the entire country, costs $600 million in today's dollars for 1 year. The NYPD budget is $6 billion. The New York State is paying for a renovation and new stadium for the Buffalo Bills, the football team, and just the tax incentives alone are $850 million.
Wow.
The idea that, like, there's money, right? Money is not the issue. There's a lot of money. It is prioritizing, and it is redistribution, and it is understanding what what we actually get for this money and the impact it can have and where that money could go. So yeah, I would love to ask various administrations and politicians to really think through what is possible and what we could be doing with the incredible wealth and resources that we as a city and state are lucky to have.
Yeah, and right. And like I said before, of the bias of the Matthew effect. I mean, this is really it. The NFL, as much as I love it, does not need federal funding. I mean, it's absurd to think that their tickets, I mean, you could go to a football game for what, maybe $300 for the nosebleed seats. They don't need federal funding. I mean, or even, city funding. So state funding, I'm sorry. So it doesn't really even make sense that it's going to, again, the Matthew effect, man, what's popular becomes more popular. It's so stupid. Okay. So Alan, final questions for Katie before we wrap up.
Yes, Katie, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, follow future projects, where can we do that?
Yes. So everything is Theater and Asylum on social media. So Instagram is by far the best place. You can't follow me. I don't have any sort of personal handles or anything like that. But our website is theaterinasylum.com. That's theater ER. And then it's the same Theater in Asylum on Instagram. We also have Facebook, but Instagram's by far the best of
Excellent.
what we post.
Katie, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. This was great.
No, thank you both so much. Yeah, it was a total honor and privilege, and to get to talk to people about these ideas, right, and to challenge each other, and to like this is it. This is one of the coolest parts. So it was a total honor. So thank you for your respect and for your listening, and for all of your awesome thoughts and contributions to the ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Have a good one. Thank you. All right. So everyone, if you'd love to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.